Hi, everybody, and welcome to our first lecture about the human history of Antarctica. This is the first of 3 lectures in total. We'll be doing 2 this week, and then 1 during week 9, week 9 after we do climate change. And the human history of Antarctica is relatively recent, given that there's never been any indigenous people in Antarctica. It's not really habitable by humans, and there's never been a real permanent population. The bases we learned about during the human geography unit aren't considered to be a permanent population because it's not people who are going to live there forever. It's not generations of people living there. And so our first chapters in the history of Antarctica will be some of the early ventures by Europeans into the southern oceans. And many of these, the earliest voyages went close to Antarctica without quite reaching the continent. Many of the voyages were conducted in search of a mythical lost continent that it would turn out existed. It was just farther south and icier than any of them imagined, and it wasn't particularly rich in gold or other mineral resources, at least that they could access. But as we know, there is indeed a southern continent. So in today's lectures, in the human history related lectures, this is an outline of how we'll be breaking them up. In this lecture, we'll talk about what very scant prehistory we can speculate about in regards to Antarctica, up to the early voyages in the southern oceans in the so-called Age of Discovery, referring to the period in which European sailors became aware of the existence of much more of the world. In the next class, on May 12th, I got ahead of myself. So in the first half of this lecture, we'll talk about early ventures into the Southern Ocean. In the second half of the lecture today, we'll talk about the earliest sightings of Antarctica and the scattered voyages in the years leading up to what is known as the Heroic Age. On May 12th, we will largely be covering what is known as the Heroic Age, which includes visits to Antarctica like the Race to the South Pole and Shackleton's expeditions. And that goes from the 19th century to the early 20th century, and it's known as the Heroic Age because of the increased focus on exploring Antarctica for exploration's sake, and for how legendary and famous some of the tales of hardship and of escape and survival would later become, like with Shackleton's story standing out as one of the more famous ones. The last lecture will be on May 24th, and it will cover what's happened in Antarctica since the World Wars. That's when we'll talk about the signing of the Antarctic Treaty and some facts about modern human usage of Antarctica, like the status of any possible mineral resources and the ban on mining by the Antarctic Treaty, the commercial fishing that goes on in Antarctica, tourism, etc. That will be after we cover climate change. And one thing I want to mention is that with the history lectures, there is a lot of information that comes in these, and not everything that I say in lecture is necessarily going to be something you need to memorize for the test. For one thing, don't focus on dates. It's worth using them as reference, and I go through this in chronological order, more or less, with a few minor iffiness, but do not memorize the dates. They're just there for reference in case you need to sort of figure out like roughly when somebody's famous events occurred. But you don't need to memorize the dates themselves. I'm not going to ask you, in what year did Shackleton do this? 1810, 1811, 1812? Those kinds of questions are not going to happen. I can promise you that. In terms of things to focus on, I will put important people in the study guide when I put that out for the final. But I will, in general, emphasize people and concepts that you need to understand the significance of with bold or underlined text. You'll want to focus on the firsts in terms of discoveries, or the first people to do something, such as the first people to cross the Antarctic Circle or the first people to set foot in Antarctica. And that's what a lot of the people who show up as historical figures in this, that's a big reason why we focus on many of them. So we will begin with an overview of early exploration of the southern oceans. And in the second half of the lecture, we'll get more into the first expeditions to sight and land on the continent. And in both lectures, a theme will be what exactly people were doing down there. They weren't always necessarily looking for Antarctica itself. Now, some of them were looking for a mythical lost continent for economic reasons, or to possibly claim that lost continent for their imperial powers. Some of the exploration was scientific, but a lot of it was to flex political might, or it came about because of economic reasons like the desire to hunt seals or whales. Many early discoveries of islands in the Antarctic Ocean, of the subantarctic islands, came about because people were down there looking for places to hunt whales and seals. And we'll actually start, one of the earlier figures we'll talk about is Magellan, because he was the first known person to circumnavigate the globe, and his voyages at least would put it on people's radar that there was some interesting land in the southern oceans that was worth exploring. So Antarctica is one of the very few places on Earth that has never had any sort of indigenous human population. So its history begins quite recently, all things considered. Antarctica sat frozen and largely devoid of involvement in any human history for millennia. Antarctica doesn't really come at all into human history until the period in which European countries start to explore more of and colonize more of the world in the process. Many of the earliest discoveries of islands and geographic features near Antarctica, like the Drake Passage, the narrow gateway that separates South America from Antarctica, discoveries of the Drake Passage and of the subantarctic islands occurred as European governments began to fund ship-based expeditions that were sent across the world to claim new territory, form new colonies, and look for sources of wealth like cash crops or gold or other valuable minerals. And there would be a scientific basis to many of these expeditions, but exploration did always have a political and economic component to it. Some things to think about throughout this lecture are posted here, and keep these in mind as we work through the history. Questions like, why did no one know for sure what or where Antarctica was, or even if such a continent existed until 1820? Why were so many tiny islands discovered first? What motivations drove Antarctic exploration? And who would first see Antarctica, and what were various other firsts during the course of human history of Antarctica, including the history of exploration, such as we'll talk more about during the Heroic Age lecture next time. Now, I alluded to the fact that I would touch on a little bit about the prehistory. And so, of course, the Europeans are not the only people with ships. The big reason why, one reason aside from the fact that Antarctica is uninhabitable by people, but one reason that it lacks an indigenous history is that it's quite far from any habitable land in general. The closest land to Antarctica is Tierra del Fuego, the southern tip of South America. And the indigenous people of that area are not known to have had any ships that could have survived in the rough waters of the Southern Ocean. The Tierra del Fuego was populated by a people who were largely hunter-gatherers, and it was quite sparsely populated. They didn't have a ship that could have gone through the Drake Passage. Of course, later, many Europeans would not realize that Tierra del Fuego was not actually the northernmost tip of Antarctica. They would come across people there and assume that these were the so-called wild people, to put it nicely, of the lost southern continent. It turns out that Tierra del Fuego is not part of Antarctica at all. It's just an island that is off the southernmost part of South America. Africa is also quite far from Antarctica. It has been quite far for a while, ever since the Farrar Rift episode in the middle of the Jurassic, in the middle of the dinosaur era, started to push it apart from Antarctica. Now, for the ancestors of the Polynesians, who were the inhabitants of what's known as the Polynesian Triangle, which is formed by Rapa Nui or Easter Island, New Zealand, and the Hawaiian Islands, they were quite good shipbuilders, as evidenced by the fact that they were able to reach Hawaii from Tahiti and its related and the surrounding areas. It's north of the equator and it's north of the doldrums. So it's kind of amazing that they got that far north. Now, hypothetically, if they got as far out as Hawaii, as well as New Zealand, and New Zealand was one of the last places on Earth to have an indigenous population, it wasn't inhabited until the 1300s or so. So why didn't they get anywhere near Antarctica? Well, sailing south from New Zealand, you start sailing into colder and colder waters, and you hit a couple of tiny islands that have a lot of birds on them, but not really any capacity to support a human population. And it's very possible that some of the Maori or the other early Polynesians might have ventured relatively close to Antarctica, but it's not likely that they ventured very far south because there's really just not a lot of inhabitable land south of New Zealand. And again, Antarctica really is quite far from any habitable land. It's very isolated. Even if it were somehow, for whatever reason, not quite so inhospitable, it's still a long way from anything. So there's no real way for sure to know if anybody did see any of the subantarctic islands or some of the islands south of New Zealand before European contact, but there wouldn't have been much for anybody to subsist on even if they did. So that does not take us into the first sighting of Antarctica. That takes us to some background related to the European age of exploration. And you've almost certainly heard of Magellan at some point. He's often cited as the first person to circumnavigate the globe, and his crew, in fact, became the first known crew to do so. Magellan himself, however, was killed in the middle of his voyage, and only one of his ships with a skeleton crew of, I think, about 15 people, honestly, one of his ships made it back. Magellan was Portuguese, and he had first tried to convince the Portuguese king to commission an expedition. And the expedition was intended to find a way to get to the Maluku Islands, which are now part of Indonesia, and are also known as the Spice Islands because a lot of extremely valuable spices were grown there. And Magellan's hope was to find a westward route to the Spice Islands, one that would avoid them having to sail around the Cape of Good Hope. And so Magellan's voyage was primarily economic. It was to improve the link between Europe and the colonies where spices were being grown, largely by slave labor. Now, after failing to convince the Portuguese king, he did get Charles I of Spain to commission an expedition to attempt to find this new route. So South America was very poorly explored. People knew it existed by this point. This was after Columbus had landed, but it hadn't been very heavily mapped. The Portuguese had just begun to establish a presence in what's now Brazil. What was known about South America was that it extended quite far south, and there was a lot of speculation that the southernmost tip connected to some lost continent at the bottom of the world. People did know that the Earth was a globe by this point. That was reasonably well accepted. Nobody really knew. People didn't know much about the polar regions. People would just kind of fill it in with their imagination. So part of Magellan's intention was to see exactly what lies around the southernmost parts of South America and how do we get there. And he would find a passageway now known as the Straits of Magellan. Tierra del Fuego is an island that's actually separated from mainland South America by the channel that is now known as the Straits of Magellan. And for a long time, that would be the primary way in which people went from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. It's relatively sheltered. This was long before the Panama Canal was opened, of course. And if you go south of this, you are in what is now known as the Drake Passage, which is where the Antarctic circumpolar current goes very fast because it's at its narrowest point between the Antarctic Peninsula and the southernmost tip of Tierra del Fuego, known as Cape Horn. So sailing around Cape Horn is dangerous. The Straits of Magellan would become the main way for people to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific for a long time, and other Europeans would largely take that route. Now, the maps from Magellan's era did significantly improve the understanding of at least what continents were roughly there, even if the proportions are somewhat off, as you'll see when I show you some of the maps. Magellan did ultimately accomplish his purpose, but his voyage was marked throughout with conflicts with indigenous people, and he died during one of these conflicts in the Philippines, or on an island that is now in the Philippines. Because some of the people weren't very happy with his attempts to convert them to Christianity and to force them to supply him and his crew with food. Of course, the one remaining ship did reach the Spice Islands a few years later, and eventually the 14 or 15 people made it back to Europe. So he didn't quite get to Antarctica, but he was rather close to it, and his voyage at least put it on the radar that a trip could be done around the southern tip of South America, and it became slightly less ridiculous and fanciful for Europeans to think about sending more ships and sending more crews there. And I mentioned that nobody really had any idea what lay at the South Pole, and map makers would just sort of draw whatever they wanted there. The map to the lower left incorporates Magellan's mapping, and you can see that the basic shapes of the continents are recognizable, but the proportions are way off. And you can also see that there's this massive thing of land at the bottom. If you look very closely, you can see that the words Tierra del Fuego are actually on the massive land at the bottom, which indicates that Europeans thought that south of the Straits of Magellan, South America continued into land. It continued onto this mysterious southern continent that they would often call Terra Incognita Australis, or Southern Unknown Land. You'll also see that this is New Guinea. This is New Guinea drawn to be about half as big as South America, and Australia had not yet been mapped. So where Australia is actually is kind of just drawn as this. They put this little insignia over it, and it's just drawn as this. So there's land here probably, but who really knows? So the southern continent here is kind of just this monstrosity, and then you can see Mexico and Cuba and Hispaniola in shape. You can see, I think this is one of these is meant to be Japan. I think you can see some of the Spice Islands in Indonesia, but the proportions are off. The map making was still in a process of formation, and also many of these areas had only been briefly sighted, not really surveyed in depth. So European explorers and their funding governments believed that there was indeed a lot of land to the south, and that there might be an unknown continent of Terra Incognita Australis that would be full of riches and undiscovered treasures, and a number of voyages would be commissioned with the purpose of finding out whether such a continent existed. And of course, it did, but it was just a lot farther south than anyone thought, and it's not particularly rich in gold or minerals. Also, that is banned by the Antarctic Treaty now, which is a good thing. So I mentioned the Drake Passage, and that is named after Sir Francis Drake. Sir Francis Drake was the head of the second known crew to circumnavigate the globe, and he passed through the Straits of Magellan in 1578. He was in the area because he had been commissioned by the English government as a privateer, or a pirate for hire. The British Crown paid him to attack and pillage and harass Spanish and Portuguese settlers, as well as their indigenous subjects, all up and down what is now Latin America. His legacy is pretty controversial for that reason. In his day, he was a hero in the UK, but he was wanted dead as an outlaw in Spain and Portugal. Now, the actual watery passage between Antarctica and South America, the Drake Passage, is named after him. It is not that likely that he himself sailed into it. His journal isn't very clear on that, but it's clear that he ascertained, based on wind and water patterns, that there was not any land south of Tierra del Fuego, and that there was in fact open water that might be explored in the future. And you can see in this map that was developed after his expeditions that they show Tierra del Fuego as this triangular island, and nobody really knows what's south of it, but they show that it's at least not attached to Terra Incognita Australis. It's not very likely that he confirmed this for himself by visiting, but not too long after his visit, in 1616, William Schouten and Jacob Lemaire did indeed confirm that such a channel existed, and this channel would later be named after Drake. It would remain, of course, not a place where many people went, because this is where the Antarctic circumpolar current is flowing fastest. The Drake Passage was quite treacherous, as I mentioned, and for many years, very few people sailed into it directly for good reason. One of the other early ventures into the Southern Ocean was by John Davis, who was one of Queen Elizabeth's main navigators, and he had also spent time searching for the supposed Northwest Passage that is believed that was very heavily sought after as a way to quickly get from the North Atlantic to the North Pacific. You can indeed technically sail through the Canadian archipelago. It's just really dangerous and there's a lot of ice. So that's the main reason why most of these attempts to find the Northwest Passage didn't really go anywhere, because nobody wanted to sail into the ice. Now, during one voyage to the Southern Ocean, when his crew was attempting to find out more as to what was in the Southern Ocean, they became stranded on what are now known as the Falkland Islands, some of the northernmost islands, subantarctic islands. They're often not actually technically considered to be subantarctic islands because they do presently have a small civilian population. They don't have any indigenous inhabitants, though, so nobody lived on the Falklands, and his crew are believed to be the first people to have spotted them. Now, they became stranded there, and they were forced to eat penguins living on the islands. They eventually were able to repair their ship, and they left for home, heading up north in the Atlantic with a large pile of penguins in the hope that that meat would last them long enough to reach home. Unfortunately, when they reached the tropics, the meat spoiled. When they had been sailing in the Southern Ocean, it was cold enough that the meat was fine to eat still. It basically, the air outside refrigerated it, but when they got to the tropics, it was basically rotting meat sitting in the sun. That left them with basically nothing to eat, and only 16 people, including Davis himself, actually made it home. And so that's a big death toll and a small skeleton crew making it back. And tales like this, on the one hand, might have increased some people's lust for adventure, but it also made it clear that venturing into the Southern Oceans was dangerous and costly and deadly. So it made it clear that this was not a place that you just went into willy-nilly. So for a long time, there were very few discoveries in the Southern Ocean. In 1739, a Frenchman named Jean-Baptiste Bouvet de Lozière discovered what is now Bouvet Island, which is south of Africa and north of Antarctica, but he did not land since it is almost entirely covered in an ice cap. And nobody would see it again until 1808 or land on it until 1822. Now, South Georgia Island, which is one of the largest subantarctic islands, and it would later be the site of a big whaling station, or several of them actually. South Georgia was first sighted by Antonio de la Roche, who was born off course from Cape Horn and only briefly sighted the island before returning to South America. And it would not be mapped or recognized as an island rather than as potentially a northern part of Terra Incognita Australis until the voyages of Captain Cook. So de la Roche's voyage found some land south of Cape Horn, and it put on people's radar that perhaps they had found a bit of Antarctica, or what they then knew as the mysterious as Terra Incognita Australis. South Georgia is not attached to Antarctica, but getting warmer or colder, if you want to put it that way. Now, the Southern Ocean, outside of being windy, cold, stormy, and dangerous overall, was dangerous because it was very difficult to determine location precisely and to navigate safely. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that it was very hard to measure longitude at sea. So we're going to return to latitude and longitude briefly. Lines of latitude, remember, are the lines that run east to west, and they measure the distance north from the equator or south from the equator. And it's pretty easy to measure latitude, including at sea. A lot of it can be done with the stars or with the sun's latitude. And there's a device known as an astrolabe, which is basically a handheld map of the universe. You can use it to figure out where the stars are in the sky, and what stars are visible depends on what latitude you are at. So determining latitude at sea was pretty easy relatively early on. Arab mathematicians had astrolabes by the 11th century AD, probably earlier than that. I will acknowledge my history is a bit off there, but Arab mathematicians had astrolabes in the Middle Ages. And the longitude is a lot harder to determine than the latitude because the lines of longitude, remember, are the lines that run north to south, and they measure distance east or west relative to the prime meridian, which is arbitrarily chosen as a line of longitude, as the 0-point reference line of longitude, because it's a bit less important as to which one is the zero line for longitude, because there isn't a west pole or an east pole. Longitude does relate very heavily to time, though. Time zones are stacked from east to west on a map, and the areas that are experiencing different times are areas that are to the east or west of you. More or less, if you're standing along a line of longitude, that means you're at the same time. Of course, time zones are drawn somewhat arbitrarily, so that doesn't quite work out, but more or less, time is something that runs east to west. Now, this made measuring longitude at sea a problem because it is very, very hard to measure time at sea for a long time, or at least it was. It's possible to measure longitude at sea if you use a sextant to measure the angle of the sun at what's known as local noon, which is when the sun is at its highest point in the sky. You can then measure the time, subtract the recorded time from universal time coordinated, and multiply the results 15 degrees for each hour's difference. So it's possible to determine longitude at sea if you can accurately measure time at sea, which was difficult for years because mechanical clocks broke down and did not accurately keep time on the waves, on the physically rough, choppy waters. And what had to happen was they needed to invent a clock that would not have any problems functioning at sea, functioning well on a boat. And more or less one man made this new clock. John Harrison, who spent most of his life working on a clock that would function at sea. In 1735, he produced the first sea clock or marine chronometer, which kept perfect time at sea, and all of a sudden made it possible to determine time even under really rough conditions. And now if you could determine the time at sea, even if you were in an area where the storm was really bad, you could figure out what longitude you were at. And knowing what latitude you were at, then you actually knew where you were, and you could produce more accurate maps. And so calculating longitude at sea became a lot more straightforward. This reduced the chance for loss of life and loss of ships because of navigational errors. And it made it possible to make better maps that more accurately showed where rocks or where coastlines actually were, and made it less likely for people to get lost and get killed or get their property destroyed in the process. So one of the first European explorers to go on board ship with a marine chronometer was Captain James Cook. And a lot of sites around the world are named after Cook today, like New Zealand's Cook Islands, because of the just sheer wide amount of territory that his voyages covered. He was a captain in the British Royal Navy, and he was famous for his 3 separate voyages that accurately mapped a lot more of the world, especially the Pacific, and it would also open up much more of those lands to colonization. He was the first to claim New Zealand and Australia for the UK, in spite of the fact that the Maori and Australian Aborigines already lived there. Scientists on his voyages recorded astronomical observations, collected specimens of insects and plants and marine creatures, and in the process documented many new animal and plant species, as well as various geologic phenomena. And outside of playing a role in opening up the southern oceans to exploration, his second expedition was specifically chartered to search for the mythical lost Terra Incognita Australis. So we'll talk a little bit about all 3 of his voyages, but the second voyage of Captain Cook is the one where he got closest to Antarctica and the one that was set up specifically to look for Antarctica. His first voyage kind of sets the stage. In his first voyage aboard the ship Endeavour, he was primarily doing this to observe what is known as the transit of Venus. And that's a rare event when the planet Venus actually passes between the Earth and the Sun, and with the right equipment, it can be directly observed. This is actually Venus passing over the Sun here, that little black dot. I have seen one. One occurred in 2011, right when I was finishing high school. So I went to the Chabot Space and Science Center in Oakland and got to see it through one of their telescopes, which was pretty darn cool. So they intended to sail to the island that is now known as Tahiti, because it would be at a latitude where observing the transit of Venus would be especially easy. So the voyage was planned around a lengthy stay in Tahiti, with land claiming and with science conducted along the way. Since they had a chronometer on board, that made navigating much more accurate, and it reduced the loss of life. Upon returning to England, they, in addition to recording the astronomy observations, came back with an enormous amount of biological specimens, as well as an enormous amount of stories about strange new lands and the creatures that lived in them. And this reignited public interest, as well as the interest of politicians and benefactors. It ignited interest in searching more for the southern lost continent that had been speculated to exist for years. So, in his second voyage, Captain James Cook headed south. He first visited Cape Town at the southern tip of South Africa, which by that point was a British colony. And he sailed south from there before finding ice and deciding not to take the risk of sailing a wooden ship into it. He then headed east, and his crew became the first to cross the Antarctic Circle in the Indian Ocean. But then as winter hit, his crew went to New Zealand, and they used New Zealand as a base while he continued to map and visit a number of the other southern Pacific islands. He began to head south again on November 27th, and he hit ice again. He, however, decided to continue south, and he kept trying to go, but eventually realized that sailing wooden ships into the ice was a terrible idea, and he headed north and wintered in New Zealand again. The crew headed east, and they passed through the Drake Passage, and became one of the first crews to do so. Instead of going through the relatively safe Straits of Magellan, they actually went around Cape Horn at the southern end of Tierra del Fuego, into the Drake Passage, and into the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. He made one final attempt to head south and discovered some of the subantarctic islands. Along the way, he also respotted South Georgia, which had been glimpsed previously. He initially thought that South Georgia was indeed part of Terra Incognita Australis, but upon reaching its southern end, he realized it was just a large island, and he christened the southern point Cape Disappointment, which you can see here, in his frustration and disappointment. So I find that rather funny myself. Captain Cook had to sail north after his disappointing view of southern South Georgia, and he thus never saw the Antarctic mainland. He crossed the Antarctic Circle several times, and he mapped a good number of the subantarctic islands. And you can see, if you compare this to the satellite images I've shown you of South Georgia elsewhere in the course, this more or less looks like it. It's just the bays are a little bit large, but it looks reasonable. It looks like a reasonable, like, first-time map student sketch of it. But he never got as far south as Antarctica itself. You can see from this diagram just how close he got. The green line represents Cook's voyage, and he had no way to get through the ice. He had no way to get through the ice, and he had no desire to bring his crew on a suicide mission by destroying their ships, by trying to sail them into what we now know are the ice shelves. And the visibility was also terrible. As often is the case in Antarctica, you have winds and snow, and he was close to Antarctica but couldn't necessarily see it because you don't have a clear view much of the time when you're in Antarctica. So he just sort of assumed that there was nothing but sea ice further south. He would, in his second voyage to Antarctica, he would cover about 60,000 miles over the course of 3 years. Amazingly, nobody died due to storms. He was in general considered to be one of the best navigators of the time, and his voyage did establish that it was possible to sail into the southern oceans and not completely destroy yourselves. It was just something, again, that's not done willy-nilly. Now, the trip convinced him that there was no great southern continent after all. And that's what he told his benefactors in the government when he came back. In his journal, though, he did say something that I think is kind of funny because he just didn't realize how right he was and how close he had gotten to seeing it. And he casually mentions, "I don't leave the least room for the possibility of there being a continent unless it's near the pole and out of reach of navigation." AKA, we're never going to get that far south. If there's anything there, it's just not possible to get there. He didn't anticipate that there would be some more successful attempts to get through the ice with wooden ships, and that eventually people would invent stronger ships that could get through the ice, and people would actually find that there was indeed such a continent. And of course, we know now that Antarctica actually exists. It's just not anything quite like the mystical lost continent that people thought it was. Of course, it's quite amazing in itself, and it's even honestly weirder than anybody could have imagined. which I think is kind of the funny part of the story. So Captain Cook would give up on Antarctica after his second voyage, and he would make one final voyage north to find the Northwest Passage. So he went from one myth to another, essentially. And of course, it is possible to sail through the Arctic Ocean, but it's frozen over much of the year, and the Canadian archipelago is about as hard to get through as it's about as dangerous to go through as sailing around Cape Horn. For different reasons, it's ice and lots of rocks and islands as opposed to the current, but it's still very dangerous. Cook sailed from Britain to Cape Town to New Zealand, and then he became the first European to reach Hawaii, and he named those the Sandwich Islands after the Earl of Sandwich, indeed the same person whom the food item sandwich is named after. Of course, it's reverted to its name of Hawaii since then, which I think is good. His first contact with the native Hawaiians was reasonably peaceful, and he initially used the islands as a base to launch his northerly exploration, which took him up the Pacific Northwest, into the Bering Straits, and into the Arctic Ocean. He ran into the exact same problems he had run into when he'd tried to sail south, aka pack ice and not being sure if he wants to sail wooden ships into that. And so he returned to the Hawaiian Islands. However, when he came back, the Hawaiian Islands were experiencing weather conditions that were causing a famine. And the Hawaiians weren't especially happy to have a large number of Europeans staying on their shores and eating their food, especially because they weren't really being compensated in any way for it. At one point, a group of them stole a small boat from Cook's crew out of anger, and Captain Cook made the mistake of retaliating. He tried to kidnap the King of Hawaii, but the king's soldiers thwarted the attempt and killed Captain Cook. So that's definitely a pattern with some of these trips. So Captain Cook never found Antarctica, and he died an explorer's death, shall we say. Not all explorers came to such a bad end, of course, and some people would eventually be more lucky than he was in actually finding a continent there. And that's what we'll talk about more during the second half of the lecture, where I will also have some announcements. I'll have those in the second half of the lecture just because it's a bit shorter than the first.